Trump 2, why he won, what it means for the world. They are here to take your questions on 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's start off with a text question from Andrew in Fulham. Was today's intervention by Sir Tony Blair into the climate change debate that net zero in its existing form is doomed for failure by 2050 a positive wake-up call for the government? Or was it just an ignoble inconvenience? Sorry, an ignorable inconvenience for Ed Miliband and his department? Preet, you know I'm coming to you first on this, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, I think Tony Blair has actually clarified what he meant. And what he has been saying is that the government's approach is actually right. It's right to invest in carbon capture, in new nuclear, and of course, smart grids is the right one. And I would say primarily in the report, a lot of what we are trying to do is already in there and it features in there. But why is it important? Well, the only way we get to energy security and lower bills and good skilled jobs is that we've got to have clean power energy by 2030. And that means we have got to invest in the technologies and in the industries to do that. And there's lots of things that Labour's already announced in our action plan. So I think, look, we are on the right track.
So move along, nothing to see here. That's your message.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think the clarity is there. And
well,
like
hang on
I
a minute. Should we actually look at what he said? Because he said there was a lot of hysteria around this debate. He said that ordinary consumers were paying the price of the government's net zero policy. And you mentioned 2030 there. That's an arbitrary date, isn't it? It could. The EU have shifted their EV rules back to 2035. We haven't done that. That's a political choice. But we could do that.
Well, look, no, what I would say is, look, when businesses absolutely understand that clean energy is the only way in terms of industrial and economic opportunities of the 21st century. We've seen the net zero sector grow massively. You've got 600,000 jobs that are directly, affected and in the wider supply chain. So this is an industry, part of our industrial strategy, that is an industry of growth. We've got to put in the investments. We've got to reverse the Tory legacy of no nuclear. This is about creating good skilled jobs. We've already announced 21 billion for carbon capture.
To be fair, that was Labour policy as well, no nuclear.
Well, towards the end, I mean, we were planning to, of course, we didn't, we weren't successful at the next election, of course, and that wasn't, possible to deliver, but the Conservatives certainly didn't take it up. They sold off our gas storage.
Sorry, how many nuclear power stations were built under 13 years of Labour or even given permission for?
Well, I think there was many that were given permission for, about 14.
I think the answer is one.
They built one, but I think they gave permissions for nearly 14. It certainly was over 10, as I recall. But look, this is a sector, there is a lot of stuff that we are doing already in terms of wind and solar, which is scalable. So absolutely we can achieve this. We're already leading in regards to offshore wind.
But the point he was making was about the price that consumers are paying, because our energy prices in this country are higher than most other European countries. Now, there can be many reasons for that. But I think what Tony Blair was saying was that the rush to net zero, which he thinks is probably unachievable, is actually causing energy prices to rise.
Well, that's not true. I mean, we've had a cost of living crisis. The fact that we have been, reliant on foreign wholesale gas prices has meant that we have got to have energy security in this country.
But so have other countries.
Well, yes, but, we do import a lot of our gas. We haven't invested or built the industries that we needed in terms of bringing those costs down. And that's exactly what we are doing in terms of our clean energy power plan.
Quick hands.
Well, if I could just correct a couple of things. First of all, there were no nuclear power stations built under Labour for 13 years. The last nuclear power station opened in this country is Sizewell B, which was opened in 1995. The Conservatives actually are building one, Hinkley Point C, which was approved by George Osborne in 2015, 2016, and that should come on stream before the end of the decade. Second thing is, actually, we do import a lot of our gas, but we also produce a lot of our gas. So that gives us an advantage over some other countries. I think overall, we should be sticking to the net zero 2050 target. I think we can be perhaps slightly less prescriptive in terms of the speed and how we get there. But I think it's part of the UK's international obligations And I think it's really important in the recent years of the Conservative government, we're actually in many ways leading the world in showing the path to clean energy. Preet has already mentioned offshore wind. Actually, the amount of electricity generated by renewable sources under the Conservatives went up 7-fold in that time. So actually, I think the Conservatives got a very, very good record in this place. I think Labour, we have to wait and see. It's obviously only less than a year into the new Labour government. But I'm seeing already quite a lot of confusion. I think you've got Ed Miliband, who is sending a very preachy, almost zealot-like message about the importance of net zero. Yet I think others around the cabinet table, I think, are more sceptical. And I think Tony Blair has blown open today the divisions within Labour on this issue. But I think
But there are divisions in all parties. In your party, you've got Robert Jenrick seemingly quite clear that he wants to abandon the net zero targets. Kemi Badenoch seems to be edging that way as well. But there are plenty of people in your party who would recoil in horror at that thought.
Well,
in sense, if you might be one of them.
Well, I think it's important as to where, in this case, opposition parties, of course, can have a debate because they're not actually making the decisions. Here, I think the key difference is the governing party, which is actually here in charge, having a real division between, on the one hand, on the one extreme, the Secretary of State, the person in charge of this, vis-a-vis the former Prime Minister and others. I mean, that is an uncomfortable division less than 1 year into government. And still, we haven't seen on the nuclear side what we did.
There were no such divisions when you were in power, Greg.
Well, I'm not saying that, but what I would say that 1 year into our government, I don't think there were divisions on this, actually. And when you look at what we did deliver in terms of nuclear, we delivered the nuclear energy financing bill a couple of years ago. We've actually had Hinkley Point C being built, Sizewell being approved, Sizewell C, and the big increase in offshore wind and renewable capacity was all good achievements by the Conservative government.
OK, Josh Tapper.
I think this whole thing today, to be honest, has been a bit of a storm in a teacup. I think it's been completely blown out of proportion. Tony Blair... very much
by us wicked people in the media.
Well, I think by everyone. Yeah, I think by the media. I think by certain MPs.
Don't be so naive.
No, I think
Tony Blair says this sort of thing. It's a story.
Of course, it's a story, but what he actually said was that he agrees with sticking to the net zero target. He said that he actually agrees with what the government are doing in terms of their investment in AI and tech, nuclear energy, and carbon capture, and so on. The reality is, there were some people today saying that Tony Blair was proving the point of reform and the Conservative Party, and that is by no means what he was doing. He wasn't denying net zero. He wasn't saying let's completely alter our course. He was saying let's bring people with us on this journey, because I think that is vital, that when you're trying to tackle such a crisis as the climate crisis, you need to bring people on this journey to execute it, and if you need it to be any kind of success. The truth is, in terms of its cost, is that the cost of not doing something now is far greater in the long term than in actually, acting as we should. So I think Tony Blair was right in a lot of what he said, and I also think that the plan of the current government is we need to keep on gearing forward towards 2050.
Tim Hames.
I think it's remarkable that it's almost 18 years since Tony Blair stood down as Prime Minister, and he still makes the news in a way that other ex-Prime Ministers simply don't, and that he still has that kind of impact on politics. And also that in those 18 years, we've had 7 other Prime Ministers since him, which again reflects on a massive change. So, I mean, I think irrespective of how one interprets the scripture according to St. Tony, it is quite extraordinary that it has that sort of impact. I think the real challenge here is, and it's for politicians and all parties and society, trying to create some sort of strategy for the year 2050 is really stretching it.
Is it? Because surely one of the big complaints about our politics is that we think in the short term, in 5-year stretches. Surely it's a good idea to think about, because the Chinese, they're not thinking about 2050, they're thinking about 2150.
Yeah, well, the problem with that approach, or if you take too regimented is we just do not know what technological options are going to occur between now and then that may make our life easier, or perhaps harder, in how to pursue that. And so actually, whilst obviously I'm not against having a target in the year 2050, I think you have to be realistic that this has to be a process of continuous assessment, particularly in the light of technological change.
Can I agree with Tim there? Having actually designed the government's net zero strategy, which was launched in October 2021. And I was very clear that we cannot be over prescriptive. We'll get to net zero by 2050, but if we set out too precisely how we will get there and the technologies involved, it'd be quite a dangerous thing. If you'd sat there in 1990 and said these are the technologies we'll use to reduce emissions in this country by 2/3 by 2020, you would have been completely wrong. You would never have projected the rise of the internet, the rise of certain renewable technologies and so on. So I was very keen that we do not be over prescriptive when we did the net zero strategy. As it happens, I got taken to court by, I can't remember if it was Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, for being insufficiently defined as to what the net zero strategy should be and all the different technologies and different ways we would get there, which I found, frankly, far.
I love it that you can't remember which one it was.
I can't remember which one it was, which is probably not good for their fundraisers listening to this programme.
And did you win?
But we didn't actually.
You didn't win?
We actually won. But
Get
we
new
kind
lawyers.
of we resubmitted and basically add a little bit of detail, and it was fine in the end. We got there in the end. But the point was, I was really clear that you cannot state, 30 years in advance. Imagine any other government policy for a 30-year time period. Imagine if you were there in the 1930s setting out a 30-year plan how we're going to rearm to face Hitler's Germany. You would have been way, way off. You would have been ridiculously far off.
Let's bring in Robbie in Chelmsford. Robbie, what would you like to say?
Surely the best way to bring people on the net zero journey is just to focus on cutting the cost and carbon by insulating our extremely leaky homes.
Anybody got a view on that?
I think that's one element of what Labour wants to do in terms of its warm homes plan. Of course, we've got to retrofit so many homes. Just thinking about Birmingham, council properties haven't had an upgrade for about 100 years. And, honestly, I think I must have over 170 cases just on damp issues in lots of these properties. So, yeah, of course, we've got to make sure we're insulating. And what we're doing with new properties in terms of using solar, I think this is really important. This is something the government is doing, but it's not just that. You can't just, this is about the long term. It's about how we decarbonise various sectors, of course, electricity being really a key priority for us.
I always think of Edgbaston, your constituency, as the posh bit of Birmingham. I don't know how right I am on that. But, just bring us up to date on where we are with the rat problem. And is that something that is really big in your constituency, or is that other areas?
Well, look, the bin situation has caused a public health concern. You've seen it. We've seen the rubbish piling up, and that is just unacceptable. Nobody wants to live in situations like that. I had many people contact me. I've also equally been very vocal and supportive of the council's position. I think since they called a critical incident, it meant that they could use other levers in terms of asking for support from neighbouring authorities, and certainly government has really stepped in. I'm glad that so much of the thousands of tonnes of waste that was on the streets has actually been cleaned up, and people are now having a regular weekly waste collection. Of course, the recycling hasn't resumed, and this strike is still ongoing. It is a matter now for Unite to come back around the table and accept the deal.
Well, apparently Sharon Graham, the Unite leader, is going to lead the negotiations now, which if I was opposite the table from Sharon Graham, believe me, I would be fearful, because she is quite a negotiator, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Do you welcome that?
Well, what's interesting about that is, the BBC did a recent report on this saying that, the local Unite leaders were pretty much near enough a deal until the National Party decided to step in. And I think, there has obviously been some issues internally within Unite. I don't think that is acceptable, actually. This is a local issue. Job evaluations are happening across the board. These are, councils that have had equal pay liability claims twice. It's crippled the finances. Okay. Cannot have that situation again.
Right, we'll move on in just a few moments' time here on Cross Question. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. including seating. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
18 minutes past 8. On the panel with me, Preet Kaur Gill, Labour MP for posh Birmingham. Is it posh?
Well, look, I mean, I think my constituency is a microcosm of the country. You had 2 wards that voted to leave, 2 to remain, 2 affluent, 7 postcodes down, life expectancy drops by 7 years, high need population. So not quite.
And Greg Hands, former Conservative MP for a posh bit of London and former Cabinet Minister. Josh Tapper, former Gogglebox star turned Labour activist and general election candidate. And Dr Tim Hames, journalist, author and political consultant. Now, you run a consultancy called Acuity.
Acuity Associates.
Yes. Acuity Associates, which I think is a great name.
Thank you. You're really a cutie yourself.
Let's move on. Let's go to... Corey's just been sick. Let's go to Jamie in York, who says, is it time for a judge-led national inquiry on the child rape gangs? And David adds on WhatsApp, if you were the former Women's and Equalities Minister in the last government, would you go hard at this government for not calling an inquiry into child sex abuse at PMQs, given as the relevant minister, you did nothing? He's obviously talking about Kemi Badenoch there. Josh Tapper.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a very sensitive issue, and, it's a shame that this has become such a political football, because I wouldn't really say about any sides that they don't truly care about this issue, about the grooming gangs and the child rape gangs. Obviously, the Labour government have said that they're in favour of local inquiries and implementing the recommendations of
But they've
the
just
previous
abolished
ones.
them.
Well, I mean, I don't know the details, obviously. My understanding was that they've announced one for Oldham, and there's still ones...
I think the one in
yet to be
Oldham is
announced.
still going ahead, but the other 5 that were announced apparently are now not going ahead.
But is that the case? I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if they've altogether cancelled them or if we're just waiting for more information. But I think whether it's a local inquiry, whether it's a national inquiry, I don't feel too strongly about which one it is. I definitely think that we need to take this issue seriously, and it does need to, where it needs to be looked into, it absolutely does. But the police obviously need to investigate where it's the police's concern. And there are also previous inquiries that we need to make sure that the recommendations are implemented where previous governments failed. So I think that's got to be the priority of any government. As to whether we have a judge-led national inquiry, I'm not against the idea, but I don't think there is, if we're going to have local inquiries, I don't think there's any urgent need for national.
Tim.
Well, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we think that there is something systemic nationally at work here that requires investigation and some sort of systemic national outcome? Otherwise, there's the risk that you set in train an inquiry, which makes us all feel quite good that we've set in train an inquiry, but ends up with a report pointing out that actually, although there are common features to what we've seen here, the individual circumstances locally were quite distinct. In which case you ask yourself, wouldn't you have been better off with a sort of bottom-up approach rather than the top-down one? Now, not least because once you enter the realm of national inquiries, particularly once you get through the vexed question of should it be judge-led and what sort of circumstances should people give evidence, the process is going to be longer. It is going to be expensive. And it is going to be almost feel compelled to make national recommendations, even if those aren't actually the best solutions.
Wouldn't it also replicate to an extent what the J inquiry did?
Well, it certainly does.
And that wasn't a full inquiry into this per se, but it was a strand, wasn't it?
True, but I think in general we have a sort of instinct for inquiries, really. I mean, when anything sort of goes wrong, there's an understandable human reaction to say, well, we can't allow this to happen again, so we'll have some sort of inquiry which at best solves some of the problems which led to the initial set of issues, but perhaps fails to recognise that actually there are other means by which, unfortunately, this sort of activity is probably going on in other parts of the country already. We just have to think to ourselves, how can we have much, much better early warning signals? And I'm not sure that just calling an inquiry a national inquiry or on a series of local inquiries guarantees that outcome in any way.
Rick Hands.
Well, I think there should be a national inquiry. I think this has actually been...
So why didn't your government hold one?
Well, there was an inquiry, you rightly pointed out, and I think there is still the ability to have that inquiry, because I think the implications here are very profound. I mean, actually, something which I found incredibly shocking. I must say, obviously I'm 59 years old. I've been in the UK a long time, and I had genuinely no idea that anything like this was happening in our country. And I think the fact, going back to Tim's point, I think it is a national issue. I think the number of the incidents across different towns and cities, probably around 20 or more different towns or cities, I think that is getting beyond a coincidence. So I think it does need a really thorough look at as to what are the cultural factors, what are the child protection factors, what are the crime issues here. I really do think the country would benefit from a really serious look at that. I think most people in this country are very shocked by what happened. And I don't think that really people feel that we've gotten really to the bottom of what actually caused all this. So I think we do need a national inquiry. And I think if it takes some time, then so be it. I think some of the immediate lessons would have been drawn and learned from the earlier inquiry. But I think we really do need a really profound look at our society and what are the implications of all of this. And I do think it's a national issue.
Preet, your near neighbour is Just Phillips, the safeguarding minister, and she announced, I think, 2-3 weeks ago, that a series of these local inquiries weren't now going to go ahead. So would it not make sense to have a proper national inquiry?
Well, look, firstly, what I would say is I'm an ex-children's services manager, spent 18 years in child protection, dealt with lots of grooming gangs, and understand just the horror with which we have seen some of these stories and how these victims have been let down, including their families. Now, when you cut services, I was there when the Blair government had the modernising agenda, Every Child Matters, when they had children's centres, when they had the right services that could all work together, share information, and pool those resources to address some of these issues. Now, we didn't always get it right locally, but those cuts have consequences. When you cut the police, when you cut local government, when you are stripping down services, so you're literally providing a statutory service, it means there is nowhere to get those girls the support to get them to come forward and trust you to say, actually, I want to give a statement and I want to take this to court. That whole step, I've worked with victims, you know how difficult it was because of the level of distrust and of course care homes being targeted, sharing this intel with the police, working with families who were just horrified trying to protect their daughters, but when they, at night disappear through a window, they don't know where they are. They don't know what to do. Of course, it's a despairing situation. Now, the thing for me is we have had a report. The previous government didn't implement any of those recommendations. We have committed to do those. The thing for me is what is going to change? The only thing that will change is if locally we hold those people that are supposed to help victims to account. Mandatory reporting is really key. I think what this government is bringing in, making sure that absolutely everybody has a responsibility to report where they are concerned about child abuse. Now, my understanding is that there are going to be the local inquiries. Look, I know Louise Casey is doing an audit at the moment of because the J report didn't look at this specific incident of grooming gangs, that there is going to be an audit of all those police cases that were open, didn't lead anywhere, to make sure that those right decisions, I think that's a good starting point. We've got to be able to see, well, what went wrong and how do we give, those victims justice? Because there are still so many of them that are still crying.
What did Just Phillips announce a couple of weeks ago then? I thought she announced that most of these local inquiries weren't going to go ahead.
Well, my understanding is that she was saying that they would go ahead, but of course, it's about giving local leaders the powers by which, how that would take place, to what extent. I think, look, what is going to be the scope of a lot of these inquiries is really, really important, because what we can't just have is we've already got lots of recommendations. We should be implementing those, not waiting for another inquiry to tell us very much some of what we already know now.
Okay. Right, we're going to do quick fire answers for the next one before the news. This is a text question from Kyle. Isn't it a bit extreme to get your car crushed for fly tipping? Now, the government's promised an aggressive action against fly tippers, telling councils to crush more vehicles used to fly tip rubbish. Local authorities will be able to charge fly tippers for the cost of seizing and storing the vehicles, and police will be encouraged to help identify vehicles with drones and remote CCTV. 45 seconds each, please. Tim.
It doesn't strike me as outrageous. Obviously, it would depend on the context. I mean, there's fly tipping and there's fly tipping, isn't there? But I wouldn't take that option off the table.
Josh?
I mean, nothing else is working. From, speaking to people on the doorsteps in local elections, you hear just how much of a problem it actually is for people. So we need an actual deterrent. So hopefully this does the job.
Preet?
We need tough action. It's an issue that affects so many people across the country.
Do you get a lot of correspondence on it?
I've had people send me pictures of cars that have turned up on their roads. They've taken the number plate, they've dumped the rubbish and they've disappeared. We refer it on to the police. In the bin crisis, I've heard of people paying for somebody to collect their waste. Of course, that's been dumped elsewhere. And so we have got to take tough measures, and we've got to give councils the powers, because at the moment that's what's holding them back.
Yes to tough action, but let's be frank, the powers have been there for a long time. Some councils actually do take it seriously. Conservative Wandsworth, when it was Conservative control, took it very seriously. Conservative Hammersmith Fulham took it very seriously in my area. Typically, Labour councils don't take fly tipping seriously. If the councils don't take it seriously...
How do you know that?
Because I've been a local councillor, Iain, and I've seen a local council... yes, under a Labour council for 8 years, and I've also been a MP with a Conservative council, so I have actually seen the council change control, and also my neighbouring councils change control. So what you really need to have is the local willingness to take action. It's all very well the Prime Minister... I remember Tony Blair doing this all the time, sort of announcing kids being marched to the cash point machines, but who was actually going to do the marching? People who were typically not particularly motivated to do it. So you've got to motivate councils to want to do that, and the way to do it is to create a greater sense of civic pride in areas that will actually lead to councils taking the action, because otherwise it just becomes a gimmick, like a government policy gimmick that isn't actually enforced on the ground.
Right, in a moment we'll take some more questions, and I want to hear more about Josh's door knocking in the local elections, and he's got about 3 minutes to decide. Is he going to be the ultra loyalist and say hashtag Labour doorstep? It was all terribly good, we got terribly positive responses. Let's have the truth, Josh, in just a few minutes. It's 8:30 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has the news headlines.
The US President Donald Trump has urged Americans to be patient after the US economy shrank for the first time in 3 years. GDP shrank by 0.3% in the first quarter of the year, compared to growth of 2.4% during the last 3 months of 2024. A court's been shown mobile phone footage of the moment the famous Sycamore Gap tree was cut down. 39-year-old Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers, who's 32, both deny criminal damage. The Transport Secretary's told LBC a choice between growing the economy and doing what's right for the environment is a false trade-off. Heidi Alexander has been speaking after criticism from Sir Tony Blair about the government's net zero targets. LBC weather: a mild night with clear skies for most, showers drifting in from the north overnight and a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC.
working from home.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:32 on LBC. Now, Tim Hames is sitting here thinking, why is nobody asking about Donald Trump's first 100 days in power? Because it means that he can't promote his book, so I'll do it for him. It is called Trump 2, Why He Won, What It Means for the World. So if someone would like to phone in or WhatsApp a question on Donald Trump's first 100 days, Tim, for one, would be delighted. I'm sure everyone else would too. Preet, Kaur, Gill is here, Labour MP for Birmingham, Edgbaston, Greg Hans, former Conservative Party chairman, and Josh Tapper, formerly of Gogglebox fame, but now a Labour activist and former general election candidate. Now, you said you've been out on the doorstep. What reaction have you been getting, Josh?
Yeah, well, I mean, there aren't any kind of local elections in my patch and Barnet this year, but we've got a council by-election at the moment. You might be surprised to hear, I'm not surprised to hear actually, that people, the response to the doorstep has been quite positive.
Really? You amaze
Well, more positive than you might expect, Ian. No, look, the truth is that obviously with any incumbent government, especially at the moment, I think where...
it's less than a year in, Josh.
Well, I think times are changing and people's patience for change is shorter than it ever has been before. Yes, not everyone's happy with everything. I think there's a real disillusionment with politics and people aren't enthused all around. However, much of the Labour vote still is holding up. People want to see what change Labour's still going to make.
Where are they going?
Well, this is the thing. A lot of them aren't going particularly anywhere. I mean, they're saying they're not going to go out to vote, or they haven't decided yet. Obviously there are always some over here and some over there that might go to Reform or might... Actually, in fact, I haven't really spoken to anyone that's going Conservative. But, it really depends. But I just think that the pattern overall is just distrust and disillusionment in our politics more than anything. It's not a particular enthusiasm for any other alternative.
Right, let's take a text question from Amelia in Manchester. Are these public sector workers wanting more money than the government is offering just greedy? Ministers are reportedly set to refuse to increase the 2.8% pay increase being offered to both teachers and NHS staff, despite warnings from union leaders of strike action. Greg, let's come to you first on that.
Well, I think the Labour government, going back to Josh's point, early days, well, I think a lot of the really bad decisions from the Labour government were very early on. One of the worst decisions was right away to take away pensioners' winter fuel payments and to use part of that money to pay big inflation-busting pay rises to train drivers and to junior doctors, which have been two of the most militant groups in our society in recent years. And I'm afraid that you reap what you sow in this. If you start giving big public sector pay rises, it's a repeat, Ian, of what we saw in the 74 to 79 Labour government, which never recovered from big public sector pay rises at the beginning of their term. So unsurprisingly, people are thinking, well, hold on a minute, this is what the train drivers are getting, this is what the junior doctors are getting, and therefore expectations are rising for public sector pay just at the time when the government can least afford to give that pay due to declines in economic growth, due to the fact that tax revenue, government borrowing is going through the roof under this government. So I think the government has effectively created their own situation by exciting big public sector pay rise expectations, and I'm afraid, I think rather like 1974 to 79, it's not going to end well.
But of course, in 1979-80, Margaret Thatcher awarded huge public sector pay rises as a result of the Clegg Commission recommendations. And here you've got the independent pay review bodies saying that teachers and NHS workers should get more than the government are offering. And yet the government, well, they haven't, I don't think they've actually announced it yet, but they seem to be indicating that they're going to be rejecting that advice, in which case, why have an independent pay body?
Well, I think the independent pay bodies are there to serve a purpose, a good purpose. They take it slightly out of government, at least the initial opinion. Of course, the government doesn't have to follow those pay bodies. That's a job for the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. So when I looked at this in 2015, I generally did follow those, the public sector pay bodies. But it's perfectly within the rights of the democratically elected government to not follow that advice. What I would say is that I think the government got off to a terrible start by needlessly, in my view, giving very very huge inflation-busting pay rises to those groups that have been the most militant, which I think sent the wrong message. It basically sent the message that militancy pays when it comes to this Labour government. And that, I think, is something that Labour will suffer for the next 5. And if you read Joel Barnett's memoirs, as Chief Secretary, he's the actual person making these decisions. Joel Barnett's memoirs from the 1974 to 79 government, that the government never recovered from those initial decisions to give huge public sector pay rise in 1974.
I've got to say I'm shocked. I mean, to call the NHS staff militant, and when they've been underfunded.
I think junior doctors have been militant, yes.
And the fact that if we hadn't ended the strikes, we had over 7 million people on the NHS waiting list. 3 million of those couldn't go back to work because they were in pain, making them economically inactive. And of course, we've got to end the strikes and we've got to pay people fairly. We'll have to wait and see what the pay body actually does come out with in terms of the actual figure, and the government.
We know what they've come up with.
Well,
the government's response to that.
4% for one, 3% for another, which is higher than the 2.8%.
Well, there was an announcement previously. I think for teachers last year at 5.5%.
Yeah, but this is for the next year.
Next year, of course. The idea that this is yearly and we've got to look at this within a very difficult fiscal situation. We've also got to recruit 6,500 more teachers, which we've said we would do because there's a massive issue in terms of retention and shortages. Well, getting the money, from removing the VAT for private schools will help sort of fund, being able to recruit more teachers. Of course, that's going to take a little bit of time, but especially in core subjects, maths and English, that's really integral. So we'll have to wait and see what the government says. And there is a spending review, so I'm not going to make any commitments.
OK. Tim?
Well, I'll be reluctant to describe people as being greedy. I mean, it's not unreasonable to chance your arm a bit and see what sort of numbers you can get. That's not an outrageous form of behaviour. I think they've been pretty optimistic. I think the climate now is very different from 12 months ago. And the strain on the public finances going into the budget this October, November means that the government can't, any government really can't just sort of completely outsource these decisions to pay boards and say, well, yes, thank you very much, and we'll just somehow work around your numbers. So I think it will be a much tougher set of negotiations this time around. It should be, given that inflation is significantly lower than it was 2 years ago. But I'm not really in the business of calling people greedy just because they put in a claim.
Josh?
Yeah, I think the premise the public sector workers are greedy is absurd. I mean, I'm not surprised as to why they're asking for more money. I mean, for many, many years, especially under the Conservative and coalition governments, they're incredibly underpaid. Public services were underfunded, so it's no wonder why the public sector, why teachers, nurses, doctors are asking for more money. I completely understand it. Obviously, as others have said, we're in a difficult climate. I also understand why the government can't actually commit that amount now. But what I would like to see is a pathway to getting to that point, because I do think the public sector workers do deserve a higher pay. Understand it can't happen now, but I'd like to see a pathway being set out.
OK, let's move on to another question from Kevin in Eltham. Can you justify the armed police officer who shot Chris Cabba now being at risk of losing his job for alleged gross misconduct, despite being cleared of murder in a court of law? Now, Sergeant Martin Blake is now facing a hearing by the Independent Office for Police Conduct, whose director says it has brought this action against him, quotes, based on examining all the evidence, views of all parties, and by applying the thresholds set out in legislation and guidance which govern our work. Tim Hames.
Well, the absolutely honest answer is I don't know enough about the case to come to a solid judgment. But I can see that there is a distinction between the legal argument about whether an act is murder or not and a professional assessment about whether or not an action should have taken place or not. And therefore, though, it does not strike me as improper to ask the secretary a set of questions. So, if you're found not guilty of murdering me as PC Dale, but there are other reasons to doubt.
I've never been called PC. Actually, I have lately.
Okay, un-PC Dale. But there are reasons to question why you made the decision to shoot me when you did, and whether or not that was wise and proper and professional. Those are.
Because you were wrong, Tim. That's why I shoot you.
Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tim. We obviously, there's only so much information that we have about this case. I think there is a difference between the law and gross misconduct in the workplace. And I can see a world in which, even though a jury might find you not guilty, that you might be guilty of gross misconduct in your job. I'm not here to say that's right or wrong, but I do trust them to make the judgment that they need.
Do you not worry, though, that there'll be many current armed police officers and possibly people who might think about doing this in the future who will be put off by this, people who will hand in their blue cards or not even bother to apply because they think, well, I'm putting my life on the line here, and yet I could be taken to court, charged with murder, and then, when I'm acquitted, there's another round of charges against me.
Well, look, I mean, this is obviously one case among, however many armed police officers there are. So, I would like to think that this
There have been several of these in recent years, though. That's the problem.
I would like to think, and I hope, that this doesn't start to cause distrust within the profession. We need people who obviously trust the authorities to be able to look at these cases properly and just. And so I hope that they can move forward in a way that works for them.
Preet.
Well, look, the IOPC is the correct body in terms of making sure, anyone can submit a complaint. And, this idea that officers or the police don't make mistakes is not, we've seen in recent times, actually, all the concerns. And so you've got to have a level of trust with the public. I think it's right if the IOPC has enough evidence that meets its threshold to undertake an investigation and inquiry. What we don't know is what's the outcome of that, because what could have come. I'm just thinking it through, and I don't know the details of the case. Imagine if other officers had actually submitted evidence because they were aware of it. So what we don't know is what was in the sort of, in the courts, in sort of the public domain in terms of the Chris Cabot case. That will be a very different sort of threshold in terms of the legislation to be convicted. However, gross misconduct, and other sort of allegations that may exist, it's right that the IOPC undertakes an investigation. We don't know what the findings are going to be, though.
Greg.
I don't know all of the details of the case, but I think rather like your line of questioning in towards Josh, I think there has to be a feeling within the system that we will back, in general, people are armed police officers who are doing an incredibly difficult job. And I think you're quite right that quite a few people would probably choose not to do that job. It's a job that I know I could never do that job. I could never make that judgment call as to whether that person, I'm going to shoot them or not. And that's an incredibly difficult job. And I think we have to make sure that the system, if you like, is going to, be a little bit biased towards the people who do that job. Not in every case, but I would say that the state needs to trust the people who work for the state unless proven otherwise. So I would make sure there's quite a high threshold in those kind of cases. Otherwise, we're not going to get people to do these jobs, to be armed police officers, sort of people who protect public figures, protect the royal family, protect the Prime Minister, protect foreign ambassadors. There won't be people willing to do those jobs. So I think we have to make sure that we don't have too inquisitorial a culture in this space.
Some very responsible answers, though, if I may say so. We'll come to more questions in just a moment. It's 8:45.
LBC.
Terms apply.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Cash anymore?
No, they do.
8:47 on LBC. We're having a very animated discussion about using cash, but there is a question on that coming up. So if you keep your answers relatively brief to the next question, we can get to that. Angie in Barnet says, do you think Trump's pride will come to a fall? And Roger emails to ask, what does the panel think about Donald Trump's first 100 days? A man after your own heart, Tim Hames.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
I should say, author of the book, Trump 2, Why He Won, What It Means for the World.
What's really, I think, striking about the 100 days, just standing back from whether you approve or not of the content, is the contrast between this set of 100 days and first time round 2017. In 2017, Trump entered office probably not expecting to win. The betting markets were 83% on a Hillary Clinton victory in November 2016. Clearly with no great transition team plan for what to do, and very much hemmed in by appointees, many of whom he barely knew and some of whom the Republican Party had more or less foisted upon him as in the ambition of exercising some sort of control over him. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, this has been the most extraordinary first 100 days, and it really emphasised the fact that this is not a normal second term. It's more like a second first term, except with the benefit of experience. And so whether you approve or not, it is clearly going to be utterly transformative, and probably more transformative in the international scene than for American domestic politics, simply because I strongly suspect that we'll have midterm elections in 2026. The Democrats will most certainly retake the House of Representatives, at which point Trump's domestic agenda becomes much more complicated, and the imperative towards spending an ever greater amount of time on international matters becomes more powerful.
Josh.
Well, I remember when I was here last time, Ian, it was the week before the election in the US, and I was talking about what a disastrous time we'll all have and everything will be if Trump becomes president again. And I still stand by that, because I do think, yes, they've been absolutely consequential, but consequential in a pretty awful way. And I think the first moment that majorly shocked me was in the Oval Office with that spat with Zelensky. I mean,
That was the first time you were shocked.
Well, it was the first time I was really jaw on the floor. You know, when you're thinking of Donald Trump, there's not much you can be shocked at. But even by his standards, I thought that was totally and utterly, that in itself made the first 100 days appalling. And then with the tariff chaos and how he's absolutely spun global economics, it's just stability through the roof. It's irresponsible politics, it's irresponsible economics, and if this is the first 100 days, then I'm not really looking forward to seeing what the rest of his term holds. But in terms of whether his pride will come to a fall, I think it probably will by the end of the 4 years.
Greg?
Well, I think Trump has been a terrible president, and it's something I think I said on your prediction on your show back in September, Ian. And I speak as somebody who's a registered Republican voter. I used to work for President George H.W. Bush. I very much come from that sort of tradition of politics. And he's following a playbook which has been tried before in 1930, and it resulted in the Republicans being out of the White House, out of the Senate, and out of the House of Representatives for 20 years. And I can see potentially the same thing happening this time. I think it will be a terrible impact. Trump won't be able to blame anybody else. The Republican Party won't be able to blame anybody else. Trump's fingerprints are all over this. It'll be like Senator Smoot in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act. By 1932, we had the biggest swing against him in U.S. Senate history in losing his Utah Republican Senate seat. And I can see a repeat of this. It's the same playbook all over again. It's going to lead to people being less prosperous. Nobody votes for politicians who make them less prosperous, and they can see it with their own eyes that has been the case. So I think it's going to end in disaster.
Why is it, though, that so many people on the right seem to be bewitched by Trump?
Well, anybody I've spoken to in the last few years, Ian, I have warned them against this, and maybe I'm not as influential as I was. But I am, after all, an ex-politician. But I've just said, be very, very careful. I was really surprised last summer during the Kazoda leadership contest that one of the leadership contenders, for example, mentioned that if he were in the United States, he would vote Trump. And I thought that's just a terrible thing to say in his own right, because it's Trump. And secondly, what are you doing pronouncing on a foreign election when you might be the prime minister?
Robert Jenner.
Yes, Robert Jenner, who's actually running to be leader of the opposition, potentially the next prime minister. And you've got this, that you've said that you were backing the other person, or potentially the other person. So I think it's a terrible thing for anybody anywhere in politics to go down that road of effectively becoming an appeaser, a Chamberlain-style appeaser, an anti-free trader, somebody who is actively campaigning to make people less prosperous in the name of some other political objective. And I think it's going to end badly.
Preet, you could have uttered every word of that, I suspect.
Well, look, I respect the
Except for the registered Republican bit.
I respect the democratic mandate that the Trump administration have, and in the end, he will be judged by the American public. But as a British politician, what I want to see, they're an important ally, is how we work together, and making sure that we do get a trade deal that's in the interest of the British public. There's still some time to go in terms of, President Trump, and how we work together is really, really important to me.
See, you are trotting out the party line there, and you're doing it, and yet I know you agree with virtually everything that Greg has said. Why can't you say it?
Well,
You're not a minister.
I mean,
sadly.
This is about democracy, right? Regardless of what any of our views are, in the end, it isn't about providing a running commentary, because we've got to work with the US administration. It's really, really important. Just look what's going on in terms of Ukraine and Russia and so many other geopolitical issues. And we want to see a trade deal. It's got to be in the interest of the British public. So, I'm a pragmatist. We've seen what happened in terms of here in the United Kingdom with some of our leadership and the fallout of that. You've got to respect, the democratic mandate given, and you've got to work within that, right? That's what true leadership is really about.
Chris in Stubbington is on the line. Chris, what would you like to ask?
Hello, yes. A Treasury committee warned some groups of people, the elderly disabled, risk being excluded by businesses not accepting cash. Should businesses have to accept cash?
Well, we're going to talk about a slightly different aspect of this in the phone-in after 9s, Chris, so don't switch off because you'll be interested in that. Now, MPs on the Treasury Committee have warned that people should consider keeping some cash at home in case of major power outages, and that businesses should continue to allow people to pay for services and products with cash in order to protect those who are less well off or vulnerable. Preet, I'm going to come to you first because we were talking about this in the break, and you may, I don't know if you want to make the revelation that you made to me on air or not, but you kind of have to now.
Why not? Because I'm a huge supporter that businesses should absolutely give people the choice of paying cash or not. And I don't have a card. I pay cash everywhere I go. It really irks me sometimes where you go to places and they say we don't accept cash. Of course, it's an easier thing for businesses to do, but there are still lots of people in my constituency that don't have a bank account, for example, or they're in an overdraft and therefore they can't use their cards. And so access to cash, I think, is really, really important. I know this is something that the Chancellor has cared about as well, and she wants to sort of see, especially high street banks, for example, we're seeing them disappear from our high street. So, it's becoming so difficult. But I think this just shows, actually, the importance of it.
Do you think this is, in some ways, Tim Hames, a bit of a class thing? And the well-off don't need to use cash? And I'll be honest, I can't remember the last time I used cash. I don't have any cash on me at the moment. I don't have any cash at home. I mean, this whole Spain and Portugal thing is making me think that, well, maybe that's not a very good decision. But I think a lot of people who are in professional jobs, they use Apple Pay or Google Pay the whole time.
Yeah, and I do think that is a distinction. I actually live in coastal Essex, and the notion that we're a cashless society out there, I can assure you, would be something of a myth. But I think an important point is raised around access to cash. I mean, where I live, 3 out of the 5 major banking providers have closed branches within the last year, and when they close the bank, they close the cash machine. And so actually the notion of easy access to cash machines is becoming harder and harder. I don't particularly want to have to go half an hour to a supermarket in order to extract some cash. So so I do think that I think the Select Committee is right to be looking at this area, and not only in emergency circumstances.
Yeah, look, there are particular groups that are more vulnerable than others when it comes to this issue. I personally, like you, Ian, I barely ever carry cash, only when I absolutely need to. I don't have any on me right now.
I'd love to be down with the youth for once.
But it does, the power outages do make you think. But then I also think, in a world where we're worried about power outages, you think then we should be entering a world where it is easy to access cash, especially for those vulnerable groups. So I think that absolutely businesses should give you the option. What I also think is we should be trying to get those groups who are particularly vulnerable in a place that they get better access to cash, better access to be able to not have to pay with cash.
Okay.
And moving on.
Greg?
Well, I think cash is important. I still use cash, probably less so than every year that goes past. I'm just amazed at how Preet manages only with cash. I mean, how do you pay your rent or a flight or a rental car or whatever it is only in cash? You must carry around a massive holder full of cash.
We've got to the bottom of it now. Well, listen, we are going to continue with that subject in just a moment. Our fun question comes from Carly in Worcester. This is a good one. A 10-year-old boy from Derbyshire has won the European Seagull Screeching Championship for the second year running, a tournament which involves children making the most realistic noise they can of a seagull. What's the best impression you can pull off? Josh, let's start with you.
You're not going to go first, here.
No, I'm not. I don't have to. I'm the host.
Might want to turn the volume down.
You didn't have to do a seagull.
I thought that's what you asked for.
Anything.
All right, well,
Tim.
there you go.
A fish.
That doesn't work on a microphone.
It's the best I can do.
Does it have to be an animal?
It can be anything. It can be a person.
I was going to laugh, but how do you laugh so that people can hear me other than saying ha, 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 ha? Not very good, right?
No, I don't.
No.
Greg.
I'm just full of admiration for the fact the boy who won it is from Derbyshire, which is the county in England furthest from the sea. You must have nobody to practice or learn from. So I am just going to, I don't know, what am I going to impersonate? I'm going to impersonate Boris. Well, yes, let's see. Yeah, good point. Let's go with that.
It was as if he was in the room, wasn't it?
It is.
You've rescued us, Greg. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to all of you for coming in to be on the panel today. Tuesday's panel, because I'm not here on Monday because it's bank holiday, includes the human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell and the former Conservative Minister Laura Farris. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about a cashless society because there's been a lot of talk after these power outages in Spain and Portugal. Well, should we all be prepared for a doomsday scenario? And I have started to think, well, should I have a battery-powered radio at home if there was some sort of nuclear attack in another part of the country and all the communications went down, you would still need a long-wave radio. Should we have 3 weeks of canned food supplies? But also, should we stop thinking that we are immune to all of these things and we should have cash at home? Have you thought about these things? And what's been your experience of maybe being stopped from using cash in a shop or restaurant?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Donald Trump has blamed Joe Biden for America's worst economic performance in years. GDP shrank 0.3% in the first 3 months of the year, reversing growth of 2.4% the previous quarter. President Trump's spiritual advisor, Professor Mark Burns, has told LBC they knew this would happen.
President Trump warned the American population that, yes, it's going to be hard for a little while, but that's just a little while. It's not going to be that way forever because these deals are going